Okay, good afternoon, everyone. That was a little bit louder than I hoped. My name is Steve Kubler. I'm a faculty member in chemistry, and I'm starting us off this afternoon filling in for Dr. Jonathan Beaver, who can't be with us. He and I collaborated together, so I'm going to try to fill his shoes and do the best that I can. But it is therefore my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kayte Spector-Bagdady, who will be speaking to us this evening. So just a few housekeeping issues. We ask that everyone please turn off cell phones. This is going to be streamed via Facebook, and we will be able to accept questions via Facebook or Twitter at UCF Philosophy. So to return to Dr. Kayte Spector-Bagdady, I actually got to meet her for the first time today and had a fantastic conversation, and this is only a very short précis of some of her very fascinating backgrounds. She is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Michigan Medical School, and she's also the Chief Research Ethics Ethics Officer, I guess, in the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences in Medicine. And at the University of Michigan, she also serves as the chair on the Research Ethics Committee, a clinical ethicist through her center's Clinical Ethics Service, and she's a member of the IRB Council, so many different roles. She also was an associate director for the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues under President Obama, which she held from 2010 to 2015. So really amazing experience, and that's where some of the great stories are that I got to hear today. She received her JD and her master's in bioethics from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and the School of Medicine, respectively, after graduating from Middlebury College. She completed a research fellowship in bioethics at the CBSSM Center, and she's also a former practicing drug and delivery device attorney. So her current work focuses on the intersection of human subject research law and ethics with a concentration on genetics, reproduction, and data sharing partnerships. And her work has appeared in journals such as the Journal of Clinical Oncology, the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the Milbank Quarterly, and the Health Policy Review. And she's regularly invited to give talks across the nation on questions of bioethics and policy, so we're very fortunate to have her here today. One other additional point I'd like to make, but I would like to thank our sponsors for this evening who've been able to bring her to us today here at UCF. That includes the Department of Philosophy, the College of Graduate Studies, the Department of Health Management and Informatics, and the Text and Technology PhD program. So, as you can tell from the background here, as both a lawyer and as a bioethicist, Kayte is really uniquely well placed to talk to us this evening about the intersection of policy and ethics, and I think you're going to really enjoy it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kayte, and please join me in welcoming her here to UCF.
Thanks very much. That was quite the introduction. I hope to be able to live up to what the website says about me. So I'm Kayte. Good to meet everybody. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about. I must admit, though, I have never talked about data privacy on Facebook Live. There's some sort of irony to that, which I appreciate. So I'll try to bash them, not enough to get sued. But, so, oops, I'm going to stand. I was getting feedback. So I'm going to talk a bit about data sharing and how our data are collected in everyday life and how they are transmitted through cyberspace to many different people and how those data are then used and shared amongst other people, whether we might be aware of it or not. So who here today is wearing a Fitbit or some other kind of, all right, so two. That's not too many. Two, I got two. All right, and also this is going to be very interactive, so feel free to interrupt me with questions. I'm going to make you talk to me because they told me to go for 90 minutes, and that's a really long time, and then I have to teach a class, so I'm going to make you guys do some of the talking. All right, so I got two people wearing a Fitbit. Who here has some sort of app on some sort of device in which they put their health data? So like a weight tracker app or some sort of exercise app. Yep. All right, so I'm in an OBGYN department, and some of the apps that, so people do, there are a lot of pregnancy tracker apps. So when people are trying to get pregnant or trying not to get pregnant, people are putting data into apps. So we got a lot more people who have some sort of app. And then, of course, there's sort of the overarching, all of the data that we like vomit into our computer every day, right? So as I'm like preparing for this talk, I wanted to pull an article on data privacy it was from Google Scholar, and it was like logging in through academia.edu, and it asked me for my email address, my basic Facebook profile information, and my contacts on Facebook, so I could access this free article on data privacy. All right, so data are coming out of us all day long and going onto the internet. So when I Googled millennials, this was the picture that came up. So this is you. These are the millennials. And actually some interesting research has just come out that found, so I'm a health service researcher, right? So I work with data too. And I need data from people like you to do my research. But when I go to get informed consent for the research that I do, what am I going to do? How many pages do you think my average informed consent form is? Guess. 50? 50 is a little long. It's a good guess, though. Yeah? 10? 10-ish? 10-ish to 15-ish? Yeah, about. So you know they joke that if you printed out like the Apple like terms and conditions, it would like reach from here to the moon. I think that's plastic bottles, not Apple iTunes terms and conditions, but like it's huge, right? And so when I get informed consent for things, that's the kind of document that I have to hand to my participants. But when you guys click that you agree to website terms and conditions, when you're plugging in your info, how long does it take you guys to read those terms and conditions?
2 seconds.
2 seconds? Wait, you mean, do you open them? Do you mean to say that you don't read those terms and conditions? Wow. And there's nothing legally requiring you to read those terms and conditions? Interesting. So there is research on people's contributions to research, and it's by Kristen Ostler et al., it's a great piece. But it's about millennials, and it was asking them sort of how they feel about contributing health data to private entities, like their Fitbits, like their wellness app, like their weight tracker. And they found that people are like, oh yeah, I'm happy to give them my data, my health data. Why? What are some advantages of contributing your health data to places like that? Yeah.
Progress in the sciences and whatnot.
Progress in the sciences. That's a very meta answer. It's because you're a philosopher. Are you a philosopher? Yeah, all right. You guys always throw off my talks. Yes, progress in the sciences. But like, why do people like get a Fitbit, right? Why do people like download the weight tracker app? This isn't a trick question.
For calorie counting?
Yeah.
Like progress?
Right, it's because you benefit from it. Like you get a little bit of benefit from it. Might not be huge, but you do it for you. Whereas in academic research, we're so cautious about not coercing you into research because we want to make sure you have fully informed consent and are altruistically volunteering your time, that we aren't allowed to give that much benefit to you. And so people are very comfortable sharing their data for this sort of low-level benefit, and much more comfortable than to academic researchers. So people are comfortable sharing their data. They very rarely read the terms and conditions, so you guys are in good company. But they still show significant resistance to contributing to academic research. So that's sort of this ironic space that we're working in, where there's all sorts of laws and regulations for academic researchers and federally funded researchers, and not as much in the private industry. So private industry is really gathering all of this data. So this is just to show you that I'm cool, and I'm a millennial, and I have a Bitmoji. I'm like just in on the millennials. I don't know if I really count. But anyway, so like it's confusing, right? All right, so I'm going to start off with a story, and this is a story about Target. So here's a question for you. Do you guys know the number one time that people change their spending habits in their lives? Holidays. It's a good guess. It's a good guess, but it's temporary. What's the big change that people go through, or they might go through, that might change their spending habits? When a child is born, yes. So, I mean, if you think about it, all right, so I have 2 kids, one is 6 and one is 3. And before I had children, if I wanted a bottle of wine, I went down to our local wine store. I talked to the person. I said, I'd really like a full-bodied red to go with the dinner I'm cooking, and they'd pick one out, and I'd go home and enjoy it. And I'd go buy my chicken from Whole Foods and make sure it was antibiotic and hormone-free. And I'd go pick out my veggies at like the local farm share. Yeah, okay. Then I had kids. And what you do, you walk into Target, and you're like, chicken, I don't care what's in it, in the cart, vegetables, let's go, all in one place, like, yellowtail wine, the big glug, I got it, we're out, right? And then I got diapers, I got my wipes, everything in the cart, and we're out the door. One-stop shopping. So that's the time that people change their spending habits the most, is when they have kids. So a lot of people know when you have a baby. How do people know when you have a baby? Meaning advertisers and commercial industry. How do they know that you've had a baby?
You advertise it on Facebook.
People put it on Facebook. Yeah, that's one way. Baby shower registries. That's a good one. Yeah.
I think I know this story, and I think I know where you're going with it.
Okay.
I think for some people, maybe you start buying unscented.
Oh, yeah.
Like they're very specific about it.
Yep. What else?
Any search history you put into Google while you're signed in, anything about
Yep.
prepare for a child.
If you're not doing private browsing, yep. If you're Googling that stuff, totally. Yep.
Stop going out with your friends that don't have kids.
Yeah, that's true too. Yes. And also, if you're in a hospital, often hospitals have contracts with private industry that they can't necessarily sell your data that are HIPAA protected. However, they can provide you with a care package, so they can provide all their patients with care packages that often include formula or diapers or baby supplies, right? And so a lot of people can figure out like when you've had the baby. But Target wanted to get in there before you've had the baby. They wanted to get in there like right as you're like starting to gestate. It's like contraception, boom, Target. And that's what they wanted because they wanted to hook you, right? And so I think I heard it over here. What's a really good way for Target to figure out who's going to have a baby? A baby registry. So not only, so people create an account with Target and they're shopping, and then they take that account and they link it to a baby registry. Has anybody made a baby registry? What kind of data go into baby registries? Everything. Like what?
The city that you live in,
Yep.
your phone number, your email address, the date that you're gonna have the baby.
Yep. Due date.
The gender.
Partner.
You can ask, the gender.
Yep. So the big thing is the due date, right? So one easy way for Target to start targeting their advertising is because they have your address, they have your phone number, and they know your due date. However, Target doesn't just want to get to people who registered at Target. They want to get as many people as possible. So how do I take the information that I'm learning from these baby registries and apply it to more people? It was your comment.
Look for trends in the people that you know are having kids and apply them to the wider population.
Exactly. What are you in terms of student or learner or lawyers? We're good. All right. So one way that they can track you is when you get those loyalty cards. You know how you have loyalty? I mean, I must have like 7 loyalty cards on my keyring, right? And I'm like, oh, I get $1 off. Yeah. Well, what they're doing is they're like tracking your purchasing, right? That's the point. But they don't even really need to do that anymore because things have gotten so sophisticated that they can just track your credit card because no one carries cash anymore, right? And we all just use the same credit card over and over. And so they don't actually even need these loyalty stuff because they can track you with your credit card as you go. And if you have that baby registry, they can put your due date with your credit card number and they can start to do things like this. They can start to build algorithms to track you. And so they found out that in your first trimester, you are likely to start purchasing unscented lotions. That's what women do. There's all like research on like autism and scents, I don't even know. So unscented lotions in the first trimester. Then as they're coming around to the second, women start buying not just prenatal vitamins, because that's too obvious, but like separate vitamins. So like zinc or calcium, right? Because women are upping their vitamin intake. Women, as they're rounding into their third trimester, are much more likely to buy cotton balls or cotton rounds. I don't even really know what they're for. I bought them too. It's just like one of those mom things. Like we're all reading the same website that tells you what to buy. I don't even know what I ever use them for. I think pink eye, it's gross. But anyway, so we buy cotton rounds. You gotta have that. And then hand sanitizer. Like if you go over to a new parent's house, it's just like the walls are dripping with hand sanitizer. Like you're not allowed to breathe before sanitizing your hands. So everybody buys a hand sanitizer. And then face cloths. That's a huge thing. Like we have them too. I must have 500 face cloths. If you ever need to wash your face, come to my house. Everybody buys face cloths. And so they were able to track these spending habits, right? And they were able to apply it not just to the people in their baby registry, but to everyone who shops at Target. All right, so now we're gonna play a game. And the game is called the Pregnancy Prediction Score. And this is the actual algorithm that Target built in order to track their consumers. So this is Cindy. The names are being changed to protect the innocent. I'm just kidding. This is just like a picture I found on Google Photo. But all right, so this is Cindy. And Cindy buys unscented lotion. She buys a large tote bag. She buys calcium supplements. And she buys a blue rug. Is Cindy pregnant? Oh yeah, she's totally pregnant. There is an 87% chance that she is both pregnant and pregnant with a boy because she bought a blue rug. So clearly it's a boy, right? Okay, Janice. Here's Janice. Janice buys face cloths. She buys Free and Gentle Tide. I'm not just making this up. These are actually metrics in the algorithm. She buys baggy jeans, not maternity jeans. That's too obvious. Just like amorphous baggy jeans. And she buys the unscented lotion. Is she pregnant?
No.
Oh, why don't you think she's pregnant?
There was the first one and the third.
Oh, okay, all right. You think maybe she's not? Guys, everybody who buys face cloths are pregnant. No, I'm just kidding. No. She's definitely pregnant. According to Target's algorithm, there is a 96% chance that she is pregnant. And with a girl, I think that the face cloths were pink. All right. Trisha. This is Trisha. Trisha goes in and she drops $300 on a very fancy stroller. And that's all she buys. Is Trisha pregnant? No, she's not pregnant. What is she doing? It's a gift. It's like Trisha's sister's pregnant or something. All right, so that's what they actually built. And it was extremely effective. So here's a story that you've probably heard that was published in the Atlantic, is that there was a young woman who was in high school, and she was in Chicago, and she went shopping at Target, and I'm not entirely sure what she bought, but I think it involved a tote bag and unscented lotion. And she started to receive mailings to her parents and her home that was targeted towards maternity clothing and nursery furniture. And her father stormed into their local Target in Chicago and said, "We are so insulted that you are targeting mailing to my underaged, unmarried teenage daughter. You need to do better. That's incredibly insulting to my family." So the manager apologized profusely, and he said, "I'll talk to our PR team, I'll see what happened." So he goes back, he talked to the team, he said, "Guys, we have to fix this. Like, we can't be sending 17-year-olds like pregnancy stuff." And then he called the father the next day again, and he said, "I'm so embarrassed, I want to call again to apologize." And what did the dad say? She's pregnant. He's like, "I came home and I spoke to my daughter, and I want to give you my apologies because she's pregnant and we didn't know." Target knew before the parents did. And so this raises sort of an interesting marketing ethics question, because the science is there to know that you're pregnant, but the art is to know you're pregnant and target advertising to you so you shop there, but not let you know they know you're pregnant, right? So to give you the maternity coupons, but in the TV mailer, Or make sure that there's like some extra formula advertising, but sort of with the sports gear. All right, so they know everything. All right, so are you guys uncomfortable? No? Why aren't you uncomfortable?
I kind of expected this.
Because you expected it.
I mean, like, I didn't know how they did it. It was like I would say something and then like a day later, like, getting ad about it, and I'm like, what the heck?
Yes, because we're starting to get used to targeted advertising. Like, God forbid you look at a pair of shoes, then it like follows you all over the internet for the next 4 days. Or you post that you're getting married and you start getting baby advertisements on Facebook. Or my favorite was when you post new baby pictures, I started getting contraception advertising, like long-acting contraception advertising, and I'm like, you are right. We are there. Right, so, but let's know that, oh yeah, please.
Even there's one more scarier story.
Oh, okay.
Happened to me myself.
Okay.
We were talking about something, and Google starts showing advertisement to both of us. The party in the conversation.
Do you have a Google Home?
No, it was just our phone.
Yeah.
Apparently,
I've heard that can sometimes happen. If you say like a code word that activates your phone. So my mom actually, for the holidays this year, bought us all Google Homes. And I was like, oh, heck no. Right? Because if you say, I forget what the code word is, but okay, Google, or whatever, or hello, Alexa.
even without saying that.
Well, yeah, and sometimes you might not intentionally, but it reads something that's going on. And there was a case just a couple months ago where a couple was just having a conversation in their home, and they said something that sounded like something that turned it on, recorded their conversation, and sent it to their friend, which is extremely disconcerting. Yes, I agree. But in the Target example, at least we're talking about commercial applications, right? So they're collecting commercial data to sell us more goods. So if I'm like looking at shoes and then I get like more shoe ads, at least I'm like, it's just shoes. But this is happening all the time to our health data as well. And people generally feel a little bit more personal about their health data. Is there anyone here, and this is a serious question, who feels the same about their commercial data versus their health data? Like whether they have a history of breast cancer in their family is just the same to them as what their shoe size is. No one really? People, yeah, you do. Okay, that's cool. Can you tell us why?
It doesn't matter if it's my shoe size or whether or not I have some sort of pathogenic thing wrong with me. It's my stuff. So
Oh, so you feel protective over everything.
I have a very small electronic footprint as well.
Okay, got it.
Just everything. It doesn't matter, even if it's like the size spoon I like to eat with my cereal.
Okay.
It's all my stuff. You should ask permission if you want to use it.
Okay, that's fair. So I don't have anybody who's like, I don't care about any of it, take it. Okay. So there are also companies who are doing this with our health data, right? So who here has heard of 23andMe? Most of us. Oh, this is good. So, because I started giving talks like this like a decade ago, and people were like, what? So most of us have heard of companies like 23andMe before. And somebody want to explain to me what 23andMe is? Since so many, yeah, go.
Basically a private company that you send them either hair or saliva, they track your ancestry.
Yep, so 23andMe is a direct-to-consumer genetic testing company, and you send them a vial of spit. It's a big vial, and one of the points of the big vial is to prevent surreptitious testing. There are surreptitious testing genetics websites. So there are websites that accept things like toothbrushes and hair and undergarments, and the whole point of it is surreptitious testing. But 23andMe requires a whole vial of spit to prevent that kind of thing, because you really need to know what you're doing to make that much spit. But you send it in, and you establish an online account, and depending which package you purchase, they will either send you your ancestry information or your ancestry plus some health data. And that health data keeps changing depending on what FDA is letting them release and what has been authorized to be released. So that's a basic business model. And if you get your results, it looks a little bit like this. And they do a pretty good job of trying to present really complex risk information, right? Because the average person doesn't really understand absolute risk information and what it means for you. So what does it mean for me that I have a 46% chance of being obese when people otherwise in my demographic cohort have a 59% chance of being obese? Because to me, a 49% chance sounds really bad, but it's better than the average person. So what does that mean? So they have a lot of, and then there's a confidence interval, which means that you can access the underlying research that supports what they're reporting back to you, and they try to rank them, and so they give you your risk. But for many of these things, so there are some things that are highly penetrant, right? So I'm an Ashkenazi Jew, and if I carried one of the BRCA variants associated with breast or ovarian cancer in an Ashkenazi Jewish population, I would have a very, very high risk of acquiring one of those cancers, of developing one of those cancers. However, for many of these things, there are a lot of things that impact your genetic risk for disease. So if I'm looking again at so these are my scores. I'm looking again at my obesity score. The fact that I have a 49% risk of obesity is not actually as important as the fact that I eat my leafy green vegetables and I exercise, right? Those have a much higher impact on my weight than this genetic risk report. But 23andMe has a very high valuation, meaning that the business is worth a lot of money. In fact, 1.2 billion, and this was in 2015. So I don't think it's been evaluated more recently, but I think it's up to about 1.5 billion now. But that valuation is not on the basis of being able to sell you guys $200 test kits, right? What is of value? Your genetic information. And why is your genetic information of value? You can market it. That's a theory. So 23andMe says in their terms and conditions that they don't sell your information directly to advertisers. So if they find out that you have an increased risk of breast and ovarian cancer, you shouldn't be getting targeted advertising about, methods of reconstruction or something. So that shouldn't happen. But yes, that's a potential. It could happen. Yep.
Don't they trademark it so they own it, and then they can sell it to people that do research on genetics?
Yes. So let me unpack that a little bit. So one thing that they have done is they've gotten patents on some of the discoveries that they've derived from doing research with people's genetic data. But yes, they also can sell this data to third-party entities like private companies, like private pharmaceutical companies who are doing research and development. And in fact, they're actually sort of target advertising to researchers like myself. And one of the available models is that researchers like myself can buy private data from 23andMe to do our research, or we can even partner with them. And if I want a participant cohort, so if, for example, I want to be doing research among Latin American women in Detroit who have high rates of osteoporosis, and 23andMe doesn't have enough of that demographic in their cohort, I can recruit my own participants, send their specimens to 23andMe, who will genotype them, send me back my data, send my participants potentially their ancestry information as a benefit of participating, and then they get to build and diversify their own cohort. It's actually a brilliant business model. There are times when this doesn't go as well. So Baltimore Ravens, did you guys hear about Baltimore Ravens DNA Day? Yeah? What happened? Can you sort of? A vague memory, okay. So I have never been to a professional football game, but I was getting calls from reporters who were informing me that apparently at professional sports events, often there's a giveaway. You get a cup or a hat, I don't know, it's a group of philosophers and stuff. But yeah, so at professional sports games, apparently there's giveaways. And they were planning just this last September to do a DNA giveaway. And the plan was that what this company was going to do was, as people are in the football game, people could swab their cheeks, put it in a vial, and dump them in trash barrels around the football stadium. and sign this 10-page informed consent form that went along with it. And what they would get in return if they logged in was some information about their athletic prowess. So there are 2 published articles associating variants in your genetic code with about a 2% variation in Olympic level sprinters or marathon runners, which means that if I'm an Olympic level runner, these variants might be associated with a 2% improvement in my performance. But if I'm like Kate, who goes for a jog when the person who's supposed to pick me up hasn't picked me up yet from the hotel, like they're not really going to tell me much about my athletic prowess, I assure you. I don't have any athletic prowess. But if you look at that 10-page informed consent form, this is just an excerpt from it, but it said, you hereby grant and agree to grant us a worldwide, non-exclusive, perpetual, irrevocable, royalty-free, fully paid up, transferable right and license with the right to sub-license through multiple tiers to copy, edit, modify, adapt, publish, transmit, distribute, prepare derivative works of, perform, display, use, and otherwise exploit in any manner your content. So as a lawyer, here's a free piece of legal advice. People don't usually like the word exploit. But on the bright side, probably no one's going to read it. Because really, what could go wrong with informed consent at a football game? No, that's a legitimate question. Tell me what could go wrong with informed consent at a football game. Beer. Beer could go wrong. Be a little more specific. Why could beer go? Intoxication, which compromises what?
Reading, understanding.
Yes, your capacity to consent, right? Like there's a lot of concerns about people's capacity, how much time somebody might spend reading a 10-page informed consent form when one is at a football game. So actually, this got pulled. The state of Maryland, Baltimore Ravens, yes, Maryland, didn't allow them to do this. Does anybody know why? This is kind of a funny legal trick. Can anybody guess? Let's get back to those barrels full of spit that they were planning to leave around the stadium. Yeah, it's a health hazard. Like there are specific ways that you have to collect human biospecimen and transport them. And barrels of spit in a football stadium ain't it. So anyway, the state of Maryland shut them down over transportation of biospecimen failure. So that didn't happen. It would have been more interesting if they'd really gotten into the weeds of capacity, but that's, they were working fast. Because it doesn't matter if what you're receiving back is sensitive health information, and it doesn't matter whether you're receiving back some silly information about athletic prowess, and it doesn't even matter whether what you're getting back is ancestry, because what they're collecting are your data. And what they're generating and collecting can be much, much broader than what they're giving back to you. So if you're buying a test for athletic prowess, you might think that all they're doing is querying those 3 or 4 variants. And that might be true, but it might not be, right? And in most of these cases, they're actually allowed to genotype or sequence much more data than they're returning to you. Yes?
Yeah, but there are 2 different paths, I think, here. With the 23andMe, they strip away your personal ID information. With the Baltimore thing, they have your personal ID. It was connected to it so that they could get back to you. So you don't want to conflate those 2 things.
Yeah, so that's fair. So different companies have different models of de-identification. So for the 23andMe model specifically, so what they do is they can do identified research in-house. But if they are going to share your data with third-party entities, usually they share de-identified or aggregate data. So that means like 26% of all of our users have X. Or best practice, although not clear if always done, is if they're going to share your identified data, everybody has to sign a broad consent form. So 80% of 23andMe users sign I agree to allow 23andMe to use my data in research. And then as an additional layer of protection that they sometimes use, although I'm not entirely sure what the rubric is of when they use it or when they don't, is some researchers then send a specific informed consent form to participants. So you might also get a specific solicitation through 23andMe to engage in Alzheimer's research, for example. But different companies all have different models.
Well, then you get the additional benefit, since they have your personalized information in-house, they can alert you as more data comes in concerning a particular illness or health issue, where it becomes tailored just for you.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's called the honest broker model. And so we also have data banks. So like, I don't know, probably almost everybody here was sequenced at birth, or everybody sort of 35-ish or below, to get to genetic screening, right, when you're in the hospital and they do the heel prick. And in many states that haven't been destroyed, biobanks are actually keeping that information and archiving it. And researchers can access that. And that's called the honest broker model, where one entity has both the code and the names, and they can put them together. But if they share just the de-identified medical information and your code number, that researcher doesn't have to get specific informed consent for you, because they don't know who you are. And then if you were to be doing research in Michigan on biospecimens, and you were to stumble across something that was really important, and you're like, hey, I don't know who this person is, but this person should really be told that they're about to die, the Michigan Biobank could then put them back together and recontact you potentially. So there's lots and lots of different kinds of models. But the other thing that a lot of these companies do is they're not just collecting your genetic information, they're also collecting related health questions, right? And so every time you log into 23andMe, it has all these like pop-ups of survey questions. So like, did you get stretch marks when you were pregnant? When you were in high school, were you an introvert or an extrovert? Like all of these interesting questions, right? It's sort of like being on a first date every time you log into 23andMe. They're like, were you good at math in high school? You look like you were good at math. And I'm like, yeah, I was pretty good at math, you know? Yeah, and so they're collecting all of these data. And then they're able to compare it to your genetic variants. And so this is a massive trove, because at this point, 23andMe has over 5 million consumers who answer about 2 million survey questions per week, because you can actually download this survey on your phone, this survey app on your phone. And like if you're bored, you can just answer these questions. I mean, so they have over 1 billion phenotypic data points to match with genetic information. Like as a researcher, like this is the world of impossibility. This is amazing. And over 80% of their consumers consent to research, also sign the research survey. So they have all of these really fancy collaborations, both with biotech industry and academia, and with nonprofits. And they have done some really incredible work together. So there was just this huge depression study that was published. There was a big skin cancer study that was published. They have associations with state and federal government. And they're really advancing the ball in ways that academic researchers with sort of like the University of Michigan Bank or public banks haven't been able to do. So as an example, under the Obama administration, towards the end of his administration, he launched the Precision Medicine Initiative. And one of the goals of the Precision Medicine Initiative is to build a large public data bank. And so we've been doing it since the Obama administration, and they just, so not me anymore, but they just announced that they have 50,000 participants fully registered, which is great. Like they've been working hard, they're doing all the right things, but 50,000 versus 5 million. And also, I don't know if you guys heard this, but just a couple weeks ago, it was announced that GlaxoSmithKline and 23andMe entered into a drug development, research and development juncture, which involved GSK investing $300 million into 23andMe. So this is a very valuable business model. So what are some of the advantages? So, you know, I'm Kate the researcher, which I am. What are some advantages of me buying private data over recruiting new participants?
Saves a lot of time.
Saves a lot of time. Why does it save a lot of time?
Because instead of having to get people to fill out forms and find people to fill out forms, you can just buy it already.
Yep. So when I want to do genetics research And so I do genetics ethics research, but still. And if I want to talk to people about how they feel about getting genetic information back, I have to sit in the otolaryngology clinic with my clipboard and say, are you interested in talking to me about a research survey? Again and again and again, and only some people agree to do it, and then I have to get them. It's fine. We can get really rich data, but it takes a lot of time. Yeah.
If you work for a university and you buy your data, does that mean that you do not have to go through IRB?
No, not necessarily, because, so first of all, you could still be doing, all right, step back for 1 second. This is a legal question. I like legal questions. So there are 3 ways that you have to follow the human subjects research regulations that the federal government puts out. One way is if you're doing research with federal funds. Then you have to follow the regulations. The second way is if you're doing research that results in a new drug or device application to FDA. When you put in that application, you have to have followed the rules in order to get authorized. So it's sort of like a backhand way to get people to follow the rules. And the third way is that many major research institutions, about 50%, it's called checking the box, even though everything's done electronically right now and you don't check a box anymore. But many major research institutions agree to apply the same human subjects research rules to all of their research, and not just research that's federally funded. So the University of Michigan, as an example, doesn't actually check the box, so it's not legally obligated to do that, but they do it anyway. So it doesn't matter where I'm getting my data. I still have to go through IRB. What else? What are some other advantages of private data? Yeah? Yeah, potentially. So obviously that's a big statement. That might not be true in every case, but I think generally it is true that it would be less expensive to buy data than to pay the study coordinator to sit in the clinic to find the patients, to give them the $50 Target gift card, to fill out the information, to analyze it, to get to the data, right? Like that just must be true. Yep.
For some purposes, you might get higher quality data because
Yeah.
fewer confounding variables. If you're collecting it locally, there might be some local things you haven't thought about that are affecting stuff. But if one of these companies presumably has like countrywide data or whatever.
Yeah. So that can actually go both ways, right? Because what's one of the disadvantages of data when people are filling out surveys just online? They could lie, or they could not understand. Yep. So the limitations of self-reported health data, right? So if a question says, have you ever been diagnosed with depression? You could be like, oh yeah, I was super depressed. But that's not the same thing as diagnosed with, right? And so but the thing is that to your point, these databases are so large at this point that even if there were some people that misunderstood the question, they have so much statistical power that it kind of evens out. Was there anything else over here? Yeah.
Do more than one study with the same data, if you had a large chunk of data.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. There are a lot of advantages to doing research with private companies. Is this okay?
Yes,
Okay. Why is it okay?
I think it's okay because it's valuable, and I think everybody benefits from it.
Yeah, the research.
Research particularly, yes.
Yeah. Yep.
There's that story of this person that wanted to test one of the genetic testing things, so they sent their spit in on their name, and then they sent their spit in under a different name, and they got back different results.
Yeah. Well, so the one that I know of is the one, there was a young woman who wrote, I think it was in the Post a couple years ago, where she sent in her spit to like 3 or 4 of the major genetic testing companies and got different results from all of them. There was just a recent one where somebody sent in their dog spit to a bunch of genetic testing companies, and they're like, yeah, your dog is an Ashkenazi Jew from Asia. And they're like, yeah, so there are some stronger and less strong genetic testing companies.
Well, wouldn't that play, if they're getting data from the same companies that can't get that stuff right, or
Yeah. Potentially, yeah, and certainly that would be something that might come up in peer review. If you submit your article to peer review, people might question the integrity of your data. That would definitely be a risk. Anything else? Yep.
I remember 23andMe got in a bit of trouble a while back, mainly because the data bit of knowledge. And people kind of freaked out sometimes when they thought that they were sure enough going to get some horrible disease. And I believe they were blocked for a while from sending the information out, particularly regarding Alzheimer's. And if I'm not mistaken. And so, they misunderstood. They didn't realize there were other factors other than genetics, just like you pointed out a little while ago. And so misunderstanding is a big problem.
Yeah, there was a phase where 23andMe misunderstood the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And so the direct-to-consumer genetic testing industry was launched in 2007 and originally was marketing itself as an entertainment device. So this was just for fun. And they were giving back ancestry information. They were giving back sort of what I would call general health information, like, does your cilantro taste soapy? Are you likely to go bald? Do you have wet earwax or dry earwax? I didn't even know there were different kinds of earwax. There are. But then they're also returning health information. So your Alzheimer's risk, your Huntington's risk, and your breast and ovarian cancer risk. And they got into a little bit of a kerfuffle with FDA, who said, actually, you're marketing a medical device because you're giving people diagnostic information with the intent that they're going to do something about it, health-related. And 23andMe said, no, it's just entertainment. And FDA said, nope. And they shut them down. And so there was a chunk of time between 2013 and 2015 that they were only marketing their ancestry product. But now they're back on the market and they're FDA authorized. Note that there's a difference between FDA authorized and FDA approved. So all these tests aren't actually going through the FDA approval process. FDA is just saying that there's enough data that reassures us that your tests are sensitive and reliable for what you're selling them for. So generally, you can sell that kind of test.
And they also give very detailed information explaining the role that your genetic plays and the role that your lifestyle plays.
Yeah, they give a lot of information. You can access the underlying research articles. You can access summaries. They are doing a lot of best practice genetic risk communication where I don't have an example of it, but they'll show 100 people and 7 of the people will be colored to show that you have a 7% risk of XYZ. So there's a lot of helpful information. Okay. So empirical bioethics is a thing, and people have done research on how participants feel about this kind of use of their data, right? So who's heard of the Henrietta Lacks story? Most of us, right? So the Henrietta Lacks story is in the 1950s. Mrs. Henrietta Lacks went in for cervical cancer, and her researchers at Hopkins took a sample of her tumor and put it in a petri dish for cancer research, and it became an immortal cell line. It kept regenerating. And it became an extraordinarily valuable immortal cell line that has been used all around the world and done amazing things, like vaccine research. And so it became popularized in the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. But one thing I don't think people quite realized when that came out is that we still do that today, right? We're still legally allowed. If somebody comes in and they have a baby and we have their placenta, or they get their appendix out, or they get blood drawn and there's extra blood, as long as we're de-identifying it, we're allowed to do research with that without consent. Now, best practice, and at most major academic medical centers, they're actually getting your consent, sort of, because when you walk in with your broken leg or with your ache in your lower left quadrant, you're getting the informed consent form that says, FYI, we might do this. But we're still allowed to do it. But people have concerns with this. And we know from previous research that some people are uncomfortable even with academic researchers accessing their de-identified information. They're even more uncomfortable with drug companies accessing their de-identified information, and they're really uncomfortable with insurance companies accessing their de-identified information. There's also research from one of my colleagues, Dr. DeVries, at my center, and they call this concept non-welfare interests. So the idea is that people have interests that are not just about data privacy when they're talking about being involved in research. So is there a kind of research that you wouldn't want to be involved in? Can anybody think of a kind of research that would, that you're generally willing to be involved in research, but a kind of research that might make you uncomfortable?
Probably the ones that produce weapons.
Yeah. If somebody's doing research into biological warfare and they want to figure out how to make your cells pop, that might make you uncomfortable. What else? Yep.
Obviously, if my genetics say I'm more prone to get this later, insurance is going to raise my rate for them.
Yes. So that's a good example, although not an example of a non-welfare interest. So what they're trying to get at is something that doesn't actually affect you, but you just feel is sort of wrong because of your belief structure. That would be like a welfare interest, like I don't want to have to pay more for my insurance. But they're sort of getting at the I don't want to enable weapons of mass destruction. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, sort of like the famous Havasupai tribe research, where researchers at Arizona State were doing research into alcoholism and then also did all this research into mental health in the community and migration patterns. Their belief structure of where their people had originated was a non-welfare interest of theirs, that this was their belief structure, and to question that was extremely insulting to them. So this is kind of interesting. So they found that, so this is the difference. So blanket consent is like when you sign up for the 23andMe research, and you're saying like, yes, I'm generally comfortable with you guys doing research. That's sort of blanket consent, saying like, hey, in the future, you can do research of maybe these kinds, genetic research. So almost 70% of participants in this study said, yeah, that's fine. I would sign a blanket consent. You can do research with my specimens. But when they started to give them specific examples like weapons of mass destruction research or abortion research, 70% of people changed their minds and said, oh, actually, I would like you to ask me specifically, because now I realize there's kinds of research I wouldn't want to consent to.
Well, of course, most people don't understand.
Yes?
I can't expect a regular person to understand the specifics of the data that you're going to be utilizing.
Right. So do you think that we shouldn't be allowed to get blanket consent?
Yeah, that would probably be a good idea.
Okay. So if I'm not allowed to get blanket consent, though, when I have all these people coming in and I'm collecting their specimens and I'm saying, hey, can we collect it for research, especially if I'm in emerging technologies, it's really hard for me to anticipate all the different kinds of things that we might want to use their specimens for, which means I have to recontact them, potentially, which can be very hard to track people down.
Absolutely, but at least then you're taking that in consideration that individual's right.
Yeah. Yep. Pros and cons. Yep.
Regarding the weapons of mass destruction, they could also be used for defense as well as for offense.
Yes, dual use research. Totally different lecture, but yes, good point. What else? Yep.
Well, wouldn't, okay, I could be completely wrong about this, but wouldn't in theory, if you need to have more consent for each of the types of research, they can just bulk it all together. No one's going to read it anyways because it would be like 300 pages. They just sign it away, and even then it would be back to the original problem.
Perfect. Now you're thinking like a researcher. We should recruit you. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Strike that from the Facebook Live. Yes?
We can return back to the hospital example. You
Yes.
said that just by consenting to treatment, you are therefore consenting to them being able to use any specimens that you leave behind, so any leftover blood or tumors.
So often they write that in the informed consent form. Yes.
Isn't that kind of violating consent principles? I mean, one of the principles of consent is that someone cannot be coerced or threatened into giving their consent. So if you're withholding treatment, if they do not allow you to use their information and specimens, that seems like a form of coercion.
So usually when we're evaluating, in defense of the many institutions that do this, when we're evaluating the informed consent form, we're looking at the risks that are most relevant to the patients, right? Because informed consent legally is this very complicated balance between the risks and benefits of what you're about to undergo. And to give people every single possible risk is actually considered bad informed consent practice because it distracts them from the risks that are most important to them. So many consider the risk of you not fully understanding that your specimen might be used for research in a de-identified fashion is so low that generally people don't bring it up. Although many institutions, like almost all the researchers I work for, do specifically have an informed consent conversation about the research. So if you're going in to get your tumor out at University of Michigan, it is very likely that your practitioner is going to come in and say, hey, here's the surgery we're going to do. Here are the risks and benefits of the surgery. I also want to let you know that we have this embedded research protocol to try to make our interventions more effective for the next generation of patients. Can I talk to you about potentially enrolling you in this research? So this is a work in progress. And then the last point that I just want to make, because it's my research, is that people often get very disconcerted about contributing to research when they suspect that their data or their specimens might be commercialized in the future. Right? And so one of the ways that biobanks often make money to sustain cryopreservation, because it's really expensive, and to sustain research, is they sell, so this is going the opposite direction. Before we were talking about private industry selling to academia. Often private industry will also buy from academia, because the patients are coming to us to a large extent. And so we found that when you disclose to patients, hey, we might commercialize this in the future, they're much less likely to consent to research. But then if you tell them altruistic things that you might do with the money, like reinvest it into the cancer center, they're more willing to consent again. Okay, so this is a specific example, and it's the example of expanded carrier sequencing. So before we were talking about consumers and private industry, and now we're talking about patients. Because just because you're a patient in a hospital doesn't mean you're not getting involved in this private rotation. Because often when you're getting tested in a hospital, your data are actually getting sent out to private firms to do the research. So does anybody know what carrier sequencing is? Do people know? A little bit? A little bit? Okay. So what carrier screening is it happens most often when people are pregnant, and they go in and they go to their doctor and they say, hey, I'm pregnant. And on the basis of their racial or ethnic background, there are certain kinds of tests that have more value to run than others. So again, as someone of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, when I went in and pregnant, there was like 18 genetic tests that they generally run. And if I'm found to be a carrier of something, that means I have, and my partner is also found to be a carrier, that means our child has a 1 in 4 chance of actually being affected by the disease. So I might not have the disease, but still pass it on to my child. So professional organizations generally recommend that you get carrier sequencing on the basis of family history of disease or having a relevant race or ethnicity, or it's a condition like cystic fibrosis that so many people have that it's worth testing everybody for. And they only suggest getting other tests if the condition is really severe, or we know a lot about it, or there's something we can do about it, or somebody might consider pregnancy termination. However, there's this new private product called expanded carrier sequencing. And researchers from Columbia, so this is an academic and private partnership and council, which makes this product, found that they found many more positives when they tested all fetuses for everything, as opposed to doing it on the basis of race and ethnicity. So, would you want carrier sequence? I think with screening. Like, there's a lot that goes into this. But many women and partners, when they're offered carrier screening of their baby, want that information, right? And they'll take whatever information that their doctors offer them, because often people are pretty nervous when they're pregnant, and they want to know whatever information they can get. But what about expanded carrier sequencing? What if we said, hey, usually we test you for 18 conditions. We have this new product, and they'll test you for 550. Do you want that instead? Yeah.
You said it was a lot of positives, but was it a lot of false positives?
It's a good question. It's varied. What other kinds of questions would you want answered if you were trying to make that decision in your doctor's office? Who's going to have access to the data? Sure, that's a great question. What else? Yep. How long will it take to get the results back? Yeah, no, that's a fair question. Does it take longer to analyze the data? These are all good questions. So there are obviously some advantages to expanded carrier sequencing, right? So we might find out more important information. We might capture more real positives. A lot of people don't actually know their ancestry. We have a lot of increased differences within couples. So one person doesn't know their ancestry, the other person doesn't know their ancestry, and they're of different ancestries. So we've got lots of mixing. And it also eliminates race and ethnicity-based screening, because we know there are lots of limitations to socially derived definitions of race and ancestry, right? So it sort of takes that off the table. Like the clinician doesn't have to guess, you don't have to know. We can get rid of all that. And there's a lot of advantages to that. However, the disadvantages, as you point out, are there's actually a much higher risk of false positives, because these mutations are not as well characterized as the ones that we've been testing for decades in people. And there's also a higher risk of false negatives. We just don't really know as much information. And so it's very hard to go into a room and give a couple back information saying, hey, we found 87 positives, and we're not really sure what they mean. And that's the position a lot of people are finding themselves in, yeah.
And I know this is super far-fetched, but considering the future social implications, like, have you seen the film Gattaca?
Mm-hmm.
In like a dystopian society, of course.
I saw it in the theaters, I'm that old, yeah.
Like, this could eventually possibly evolve into a kind of social impact as shown in that movie.
Yeah.
And that's a negative as well.
Right, because then what do you do with that information? I mean, it's hard enough to get a positive. So if I got a positive carrier screen, so this is interesting. There's actually data that have found that. So if I get a positive carrier screen, the next thing to do is do what? What's the next thing to do? If it's autosomal recessive, you test the partner, right? Because they're not going to get it unless you're both carriers. And when they were doing research on expanded carrier screening, they found that over 60% of the women who tested positive then didn't bring in their partner for testing. So they didn't actually care. So when you offered them expanded carrier screening, they're like, yeah, sure, whatever, it's fine. But then when you're like, oh, now we got to take the next step, which requires, getting your partner's butt in here, then they're like, oh, that's not worth it. So it's interesting, the motivations of this stuff.
Well, that can come down to cost too, because now you're
Yes.
potentially giving yourself more business.
Yes.
Like,
Yep.
that gets into a dangerous place.
Yeah. So there are pros and cons to this much data generation. More information isn't always a good thing. And so I'm always looking for a pithier way to describe this, but the way I'm currently describing it is sort of the clinical information versus research data value gap. Not pithy, it's not a good hashtag. But the idea is that the clinical information that we're returning to people isn't as valuable as the research data that we're generating to improve the test for future patients. Yeah, okay. You guys with me on that one, right? And so, but we're not saying to patients, hey, can you take this test so that in 5 years we can give patients a better test? We're saying to them, hey, can you take this test so we can help you? And that's not necessarily true all of the time with all of our tests. Because here's the business model, and this is where this talk gets really sophisticated. So I'm going to need you guys to keep up, okay? All right, here is Rodney Researcher. And Rodney Researcher is trying to fill out his IRB paperwork to go through his own internal system, and he's trying to recruit his participants, and he's like, oh my God, I can't do this, I don't have time, I'm on the 10-year clock, and even though they give us 7 years, it actually has to be submitted in 5.5 years, and I need 35 publications by the time that happens, and there's no way I can go through all of this. So that's Rodney. He's concerned. And it also costs money, right? It costs money to recruit these people, it costs money to pay these people. All right, so this is Sydney Consumer. And Sydney, bless her heart, thinks that it's a good idea to send her genetic data and her related health information and her money to a private genetic testing company in return for some information that might or might not be helpful to her. These companies then take that data, they de-identify Sydney, and they can patent it like they have before, which makes them money. Or they can sell it to Rodney, which also makes them money. So who does this look like a really good deal for? Yeah, the companies, right? It does. So why does this matter?
Because they're wanting to gain the information not for the benefit of an individual, but the benefit of themselves.
Why do we care?
In my opinion, it shouldn't matter, but people care, I guess. They feel that they should be spending less money or receiving more benefits and whatnot.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Maybe it causes concern that their bottom line is more profit oriented than, people out.
Yeah. So just sort of like societally, maybe one objects to it. Yep.
One way of looking at it is against justice.
Okay. We like the word justice. This is a safe space for justice. Why? Why is it against justice?
Because the benefit is not equally provided to both parties.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, for Sydney is
Bless her heart.
Sure. Provides the information, the money, and everything, and who benefits it is the company.
Yeah. Yes.
One of the things that struck me back when you asked, is this okay? I didn't know how to answer the question, because unlike a lot of companies, they can keep this data and do with the data whatever is allowed under the current regulations. So if FDA changes, if we deregulate, suddenly they can do a lot more with the data. And to me, that renders the informed consent moot. The informed consent may be a decision I made at the time under current social structure. But as social structure changes, they can do whatever they want within that limit, driven by profit. So I mean, I don't even know how to answer their informed consent question.
Because it might be informed consent one day, but it's not the next day.
It's different from a car where the car only lasts, say, 10 years, right? And then the relationship that I have in buying the vehicle and agreeing to use it is
Right.
dissolved.
The data are
Because
forever.
It's very finite.
Yeah.
This is not.
Correct. Yep. Back there.
Well, it's interesting to me talking about this and then thinking about our creative product, like music and what we publish. And we want credit for all of that. And we want the money that comes from that. And yet we're totally willing to give up our biological matter, so to speak, so easily, and other types of data. I mean, why do we not see that?
And in fact, often we're paying them to take our biological matter in our data.
Yeah, exactly.
One more thing that comes to my mind is that the scary part is they know more than us, even under the current regulation, right? For example, 23andMe knows more than me about myself.
Under certain definitions. Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. Yeah. And then one more over here. Yeah, I mean, so I think that that's a really interesting point. And the point was, what is our obligation to really thoroughly make sure that the person actually understands what they're consenting to? And one of the things that I'll just draw your comparison to is in clinical care, right? Because, I mean, how well do we think that people actually understand what they're consenting to in clinical care versus research? Like, we do some really complicated things sometimes in clinical care. So why is clinical care different? You know, in research, we've got all these regulations. I teach trainings once a month on how to get fully informed consent in research. You know, why do we care more in research than we do in clinical care about informed consent? Seems like it. Maybe we don't, but it seems like it. Why? Yeah?
I know there's a name for it, but you trust your physician or that doctor. There's like a sense of that their priority is your health.
Fiduciary duty. Yeah, because clinicians theoretically they do, but theoretically they're adhering to it, have a fiduciary duty to act in your best interest, right? Like you as an individual. But researchers, their main duty is to sort of generate generalizable knowledge for future people like you. So our standards are often lower for clinical informed consent than research informed consent in terms of like our regulatory structures. So that was a little bit of a tangent, but a good one. Yeah.
I don't buy the
Okay.
justice argument.
You don't buy justice. I like a man who will take that
I don't buy the
position.
justice argument. In other words, I don't think that when you enter into an agreement that both parties have to mutually benefit exactly the same
Okay.
for that.
Yeah.
For one thing, sure, you do benefit from the information you're paying for it. But then there's a societal benefit as well, I think, in the research, the discoveries that are made. I think that has to be taken into account as well.
Yeah, so I completely agree. So the point was that when people are consenting to research, they're not consenting to benefit themselves. Usually we tell participants, like, this is not for you. This is for future patients like you. And there are very rare circumstances in which we actually talk to patients about potential benefits. And that's usually sort of at end of life, the Hail Mary, like we don't have anything else, but there's this drug that they're testing, and it might help, it might not. We have equipoise, we don't know. But at the very least, you might benefit future patients. So I agree that in the researcher participant context, justice is not served by an equity between the participant and the research. Justice is served between an equity between the risks to the participant and the benefit to society. Yes, fresh voice. Okay.
It's necessarily a non-zero-sum transaction where you have all parties within society out there benefiting, but we have this aversion towards something we perceive as an imbalance in that transaction. But we're still benefiting, just not necessarily as much as someone else, or vice versa.
Right.
It's not that cost to us.
So we're benefiting as society, or we're as individuals that make up a society that might benefit for future advancements in research. Totally, I agree. Oh, we're getting fiery. I like it. Yep, go.
I wanted to say, when the motivation is money for 23andMe, they don't have their reputation on the line like a researcher would have. Like in academia, if you were to get peer reviewed and then it was found that your data was sort of like faulty, then you'd lose a lot of credibility. But a company that's for fun doesn't really have that same reputation on the line. And so by buying the data from these companies, it might be faultier and end up harming people overall.
Okay, so that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. And the point is whether data are more or less reliable from these companies because of the peer review process and reputational harm if the data are unreliable. And I would actually argue that the opposite is true, because if people can't publish in peer-reviewed literature on the basis of 23andMe data, and we can advance science, then their data don't have value. So in terms of a business product, they should be just as invested in the accuracy and reliability as their data as anyone else. Because if the data are worthless, then the data are worthless. I think it's a really good point, though. Yes?
Well, there's also an asymmetry, I think, between the company and the individual. The company is engaged in a market transaction. The individual is engaged presumably in something else, but not thinking market transaction. Thinking harm. So let's imagine they're thinking market transaction. So let's imagine Henrietta Lacks. For Henrietta Lacks, the problem was not that she gave up her HeLa cell line, but that there was no market there and she couldn't get competing bids from different places in and get the highest possible price for that raw material. So I can't imagine a market for these things, and I can imagine all sorts of abuses of that market. But it highlights the asymmetry of, one side is engaging in a marketplace transaction and the other side is engaging in something very different from that.
Yeah, so the point, I'm just repeating it for Facebook Live, but the point is about how there's market asymmetry between the power of the participants to market their data versus the power of the companies to market the aggregate data. And one of the challenges is that, sure, if Henrietta Lacks or John Moore, the other famous biospecimen case, knew ahead of time that their specimens were really valuable, then yes, maybe they'd have negotiation power. But the challenge is that we have to go through hundreds and hundreds of thousands of participants to find one that's of value. So it's really de-incentivized. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Okay, so back to where we were talking about. I was talking about potential harms of using private databases for the majority of our research, including research that's federally funded. So one potential harm is access. So who gets access to these data, right? So who gets to, so it's sort of like, have you guys heard of like the gatekeeper concept, right? So if I want to use 23andMe data, I have to ask 23andMe for permission to use their data. And they might approve me and they might not. And I'm not sure on what the secret sauce is made out of, right? And then also, if people are allowed to keep people out of that database, then who can buy into it? Who can buy data back from it? So this is an example from before when the Supreme Court invalidated patents on genetic variants, is the Myriad example. So Myriad was the first company to patent those BRCA variants associated with an increased risk in breast and ovarian cancer. And so if you couldn't buy your test from Myriad, you weren't accessing those data. And if you weren't a Myriad researcher, you weren't doing research with those data. And they had over 1 million participants by the time in 2013 when SCOTUS invalidated their patent. But at that point, they'd already built the most robust database, right? And so the next day, all these companies went online selling BRCA testing because they were legally allowed to do so now. But if you didn't have like one of the most obvious variants, they didn't know what to do for you because they didn't have this decades-long database of all of the people with all the different genetic variants and all of their health outcomes. So the association of lots of different people and lots of different health outcomes is of value in and of itself, right? Because they lost the patent, but they still had the monopoly on the best data at that time. Another potential problem is think of these data banks like drugs. So this is a little outdated because now there's a generic EpiPen, but remember when the EpiPens went up $600 a couple years ago? And this is crazy. I mean, so my daughter has an egg allergy, and we had to buy an EpiPen for her classroom. She needs, because they eat lunch in their classroom, we needed to buy an EpiPen for the front office for when she was at recess because they couldn't get the EpiPen from the classroom. They would go to the front office if she was out on the playground and she had an allergic reaction. And we needed to get an EpiPen for aftercare because aftercare is run by a different company than the school. So that's 3 of them. And then we need one. So it's 4 of them at $600 each. So, what happens when the price of accessing the data rapidly increase? So we're thinking of the price of accessing the product, but what if the price of accessing sort of the back-end data that are generated from those products increase? And then also the last potential harm that I'll highlight are bias in private data banks, right? Because if you have to pay to get into the private data banks, what am I more likely to be? If I have to pay to get into the data bank? Wealthy. I'm more likely to have what? Insurance, right? I'm paying insurance, or I can pay out of pocket. And if you look at global genetic databases worldwide, I'm also much more likely to be white or Asian. But if we're looking just at those of African, mixed ancestry, Hispanic and Latina, Pacific, Arab and Middle Eastern, and Native peoples, we're talking about 4%. They're making up 4% of global genetic databases, right? And if we're investing all of this time and effort into precision medicine and to making global data make us be able to make better clinical choices for you, the kinds of communities that are represented in these databases matter. Because if we don't have representation from your community, however it's defined, we're going to be less likely to be able to make targeted recommendations. And then also, people are entering into agreements with these private industry, and we don't really know what the agreements say. So I don't really know what the cost is and under what circumstances and who's getting what. Or whether people are signing gag orders or do not disclose, we just don't know because they're private contracts, so we don't have access to that. So we don't know what's driving this market. So this is my last slide. And what I'd like to argue is sort of what we're looking at is a tragedy of the data commons. So people have argued in the past that there's something called a knowledge commons. So you guys know what the regular old tragedy of the commons is, right? So if there is a field of grass that everybody's sharing to graze their sheep, if people choose to allow their sheep to overgraze, that harms everybody. And ideally, everybody would only graze their sheep as much as needed. But if there's a bad apple or a bad actor that overgrazes their sheep, everyone suffers. So that's why there's a sheep on the slide. So that's what the tragedy of the commons is. But if everybody is sort of acting in a way that is in their own self-interest, it's completely rational when we're accessing data. So private industry, like, that's a great business model. It's brilliant. It's worth a lot of money. Clinicians, it's very hard for OBGYNs when patients come in and they say, hey, I saw expanded carrier sequencing advertised. I want that, especially since it's often their first appointment. And so, then they just go to someone else if you don't give them what they want. Rodney the researcher, it's less expensive for him. Remember the 5.5-year tenure clock. That's really fast. That's a lot of articles. Makes sense for him. Professional organizations, they don't necessarily have a bone in this fight, and actually some of them are creating their own data systems themselves. And the government, so FDA regulates the reliability and accuracy of the data that are being returned, but they don't necessarily regulate all the data that are going out the back door. And the law has been fairly protective of researchers in the classic cases. So it's this incentive structure where really everyone's acting completely rationally, but we're sort of investing in this cycle that ultimately might be harmful. So that's my talk. So I'm open to questions now.
Just as a comparison, when the human genome was decoded, it was done by a private company as well as government.
Mm-hmm.
And at first there was a race between the two, as I recall, but it ended up being a partnership which actually reduced the cost, I think, overall, and allowed the information to be used to the public benefit. There was still some private money profit to be made as well. And of course, the National Institutes of Health, whenever they fund research, you're much more likely to benefit at much less cost. Like the EpiPen, I think, is an example of one where you're likely to have to pay through the nose. So unfortunately, the government seems to be cutting back on government research. So I don't know how that relates to your talk here, but.
Yeah, so there's not necessarily a relationship between federally funded research and accessibility of the data, although NIH and FDA have done a lot of things to try to improve that. So one example is journal articles. So not everyone can process the scientific literature, but often people are doing research with federal, taxpayer funds, and then they're publishing in journals that are behind paywalls that you can't read. So one of the things that the federal government a couple of the things that the federal government are doing is, one, they're asking people to upload their data into these public data resource databanks. Another thing is that you can also upload your article, sort of not the final version that's on the nice letterhead and stuff, but the Word version in PDF form, and sometimes with the peer review, sometimes not, depending on the contract you sign with the journal, to public article banks. And then also another thing you can do as best practice is, and I try to do this because I write about data privacy, so I should be doing this, is submit supplements to your articles. So they don't usually let you publish all of your data. So if I do a 50-state survey looking at different ways states regulate genetic testing, the journal doesn't actually want to print that. But I can upload that as a supplement so other people can have access to my research, and so they can build on it, and other people can check it, quite frankly, too, and see if there's errors, which helps us with data integrity. Yeah. Were there Twitterverse questions?
Twitter question, yeah.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, so this one's from @Allison So what are your thoughts on the use of 23andMe and other DNA ancestry websites to catch criminals like the Golden State Killer?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I did a podcast with Wharton a couple of months ago on the Golden State Killer case, and it's really interesting. So just to give you a little bit of quick background. So what happened was, the Golden State Killer is from a long time ago, but terrible person, killed a lot of people in terrible ways, and they'd been searching for him for decades. And what they ended up doing is there are all of these DNA databanks that are publicly accessible. So people contribute their data and their information, and they share. It's sort of like a patients like me model where you can share your data. And what they did was they actually had blood spots from the crime scenes back in the 50s, I think it was. And they sequenced the person's DNA. So they had the killer's DNA, and they started submitting it to databases. But here's the thing about your genetics. It's not just you, it has information about your blood relatives, right? So what they ended up finding was like a third cousin of the killer. And by doing that, they were able to figure out with like publicly available information, they were able to triangulate what relatives lived in the area of where the attacks had happened. And they were able to actually re-identify the killer, who was a retired cop, still living in the community, through these publicly available websites. So he wasn't actually, you don't need to be stupid enough to like submit your data yourself. It's sort of like when I was applying for TSA PreCheck on my way here, she's like, are you a criminal on the run? As I'm like standing there with all of my fingers on the database. I'm like, no, that would be dumb. I'm a lawyer. Like, you shouldn't do that. But it's sort of like that, right? And what happens actually a lot is, a lot, relative risk. What happens sometimes, but is really bad for those people, is if you find potentially that your social father is not actually your biological father when you submit to one of these databases, or you find that you have a half-sibling that you didn't know existed. And this happens to people. It's amazing. So I don't know if any of you contribute sperm to banks, but if you do, and you're signing an informed consent form, and that informed consent form says that they can keep your information confidential, I would be very wary of that informed consent form. Because what can happen is if your blood relative contributes to one of these genetic data banks, and your future biological offspring also does, they can triangulate back to you. And that has also happened. Privacy is dead. What else? So that's a great question. So what was the question? I know it was great, but did I answer it? Oh yeah, well, so like everybody's like really worked up about this and like concerns about it. So it's not the first. There was like a strangler case, and we also found the strangler back in the day. It's just that we're like much more in tune with genetic testing now. But yeah, no, it's really interesting. Yes?
I'm not sure if you answered it. Did you think it was an invasion of privacy for the detective to upload the DNA of the suspect?
Do I think it was an invasion of privacy of the suspect? No, because I believe that people waive their right to privacy when they start killing people. But I think it was an invasion of privacy of the cousins who donated, I think potentially yes, particularly since that wasn't one of the approved uses of the data when the terms and conditions when they contributed it. And actually the company who sponsored it, I believe it's true that the police officers had to sort of misinform who they actually were, because you weren't allowed to contribute an unconsenting specimen to the data bank. And so they had to say that they were the person that they were. So it's really hard because it's a really good case. This was a really bad guy, right? It's sort of like bad cases make bad policy. This is a really bad dude. Like, we want him in jail. And so you're like, yeah, okay, I can get behind that. Like, that's worth the waiver in privacy. But suddenly then, they're accessing the CODIS, which is the FBI and law enforcement databases, and they're re-identifying people that way. And just like we're talking about sort of wealthy white bias in these fancy private, we've also got all sorts of other biases in our federal enforcement databases. Like, the people who are in there are more likely to be the kinds of people who end up in there. And we're more likely to identify them because they're more likely to have blood relatives in there. And so the Golden State Killer, I can get behind putting him behind bars. But I start to get really worried when we start to take steps back and back and back from that. And we start applying the data in fuzzier ways. Yeah?
Is there anything meaningful to say about how different countries are handling this question and allowing companies to, like 23andMe, to operate? Are there fundamentally different approaches, or we're all sort of bundling in this together in the same way?
Yeah, so the question is about how different countries approach this. And there are some differences. An example I'll give you is in Germany, where it's much more highly regulated. And also the discrimination structures are much more protective. So in the US, we have the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which protects us against our employers or our health insurers from discriminating against us with our genetic information. But it doesn't protect long-term care insurance. And also, we all know how hard it is to actually regulate discrimination, right? Discrimination is very hard to control, and it's very hard to prove that it's happening. And so there are a lot of imperfect systems, but they're very different on the basis of history. But we're America, freedom. So, yes?
Wasn't there a criminal case where the law enforcement wanted to gather some DNA, and they had a suspect, but they got it from like cigarette butts that he'd thrown out, or a McDonald's cup that he'd used, or something like that.
Yeah.
He was obviously uninformed,
Right.
but I don't remember the outcome.
Yeah, well, so the general rule is that if you abandon things, that the police can gather them. So if you are under interrogation and they say, here, have some coffee, like, you know, it's not for your benefit. It's because they can test the cup. If you leave trash out on the sidewalk, which is owned by the city you live in, you have abandoned that. And the police can go through the trash and see what's in there. And I actually think that going through the trash was involved in the Golden State Killer case as well. I think that that's how they ended up catching him, was then they like found the 4 people whose trash they should test and ended up testing his trash. Cool. So any last hurrah disagreement? Awesome. We can talk after. I think I'm getting like your 90 minutes are up. All right. Thank you, everybody.